I walked through my father's front door that Christmas morning, holding Sarah's hand and feeling genuinely excited for the first time in years. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon filled the air, and garland draped every door frame like something from a holiday movie. Sarah squeezed my fingers, whispering how beautiful everything looked, and I felt proud to finally introduce her to my family after 6 months of dating. We followed the sound of laughter into the dining room where I stopped cold. The mahogany table stretched elegantly before us, set with pristine white linens and gleaming silverware for exactly 6 people. My father Frank stood at the head, flanked by my stepmother Patricia and her 3 adult children, all wearing matching holiday sweaters. Every chair was occupied. There was no place for me. Frank's eyes met mine, and his mouth curved into a cruel smirk as he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Oops, we miscounted. Seats are only for family." The words hit me like ice water. The room erupted in snickers and knowing glances. Patricia, covering her mouth in mock surprise, while her children Marcus, Jessica, and Brandon exchanged amused looks. I stood there frozen still, holding Sarah's hand, feeling her grip tighten as she realized what was happening. 20 years. 20 years since my mother died when I was 12, and Frank married Patricia 18 months later. 20 years of being the outsider in my own father's house, watching Patricia's children take center stage at every holiday, every birthday, every family milestone. I remembered my 13th birthday when Patricia suggested we skip the cake this year because Brandon had a soccer game. I remembered graduation day when Frank missed my speech because Jessica needed help moving into her dorm. I remembered my engagement announcement last month when Frank changed the subject to Marcus's promotion before I could finish speaking. Sarah's hand trembled in mine. She had heard all my stories about feeling excluded, but witnessing it firsthand left her speechless. This beautiful woman who loved me unconditionally was watching my own father publicly humiliate me on Christmas Day. "Will, I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the continued chuckling around the table. Patricia stepped forward, her perfectly manicured nails adjusting the holly centerpiece. "Oh, sweetie, didn't Frank tell you? We planned this dinner for immediate family only. You know, people who actually belong here." Her smile was razor sharp, and her children nodded in agreement like trained seals. Frank straightened his shoulders, looking every bit the patriarch he believed himself to be. "Patricia's right. This table represents the family that matters. The family that shows up, that contributes, that actually cares about being here." My stomach dropped. I had driven 3 hours in holiday traffic to be here. I had bought gifts for everyone, including Patricia's ungrateful children who had never once acknowledged my existence at previous gatherings. I had rearranged my work schedule and turned down invitations from friends who actually wanted my company. "Dad, what are you talking about?" "I've been coming to Christmas dinner for years." "Have you really, though?" Marcus interjected, leaning back in what used to be my chair at family dinners. "I mean, you show up, you eat, you leave. You never help with preparation. You never ask about our lives. You just take up space." The accusation stung because it held a grain of twisted truth. I had stopped offering to help years ago after Patricia consistently rejected my assistance, claiming I didn't know where anything went in her kitchen. I had stopped asking about their lives after being met with one-word answers and eye rolls whenever I tried to engage. Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "Plus, you never bring anything. Mom spends days cooking, and you just waltz in empty-handed expecting to be fed." I wanted to remind them about the expensive wine I brought last year that Frank drank alone, while telling me it wasn't quite the right vintage for the meal. I wanted to mention the homemade dessert Sarah and I had prepared this morning that was currently sitting in my car because I hadn't been given the chance to bring it inside. "Will," Frank said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I remembered from childhood. "Maybe it's time you understood that being blood-related doesn't automatically make someone family. Real family shows commitment. Real family earns their place at the table." Sarah finally found her voice. Excuse me, but Will talks about all of you constantly. He loves you. He drove here from Connecticut just to spend Christmas with you. Patricia's laugh was like breaking glass. Oh, honey, that's sweet that you believe that. But actions speak louder than words, don't they? And Will's actions have shown us exactly where his priorities lie. I looked around the room, taking in the scene with new clarity. The dining room that once belonged to my mother had been completely redecorated in Patricia's taste. Gone were the family photos that included me replaced with professional portraits of Patricia's children. The china cabinet that once held my mother's good dishes now displayed Patricia's collection of expensive crystal. But what broke my heart completely was seeing my late mother's china set. The delicate blue and white pattern she had inherited from her grandmother being used as place settings for Patricia's children. Those dishes were supposed to be mine. Mom had written it in her will, had shown me the papers when she got sick. Frank had promised to save them for me for my own family someday. Those are my mother's dishes, I said quietly. Frank's expression hardened. Those dishes belong in this house, where they're appreciated and taken care of, where they're used by people who understand their value. But they were left to me. Mom wrote it down. You showed me the will. Patricia stepped closer, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Oh, sweetheart, that was so long ago. People change their minds. Frank realized these dishes belong with a family that actually uses nice things properly. They're much safer here than in some cramped apartment somewhere. The casual dismissal of my living situation, Sarah and I had recently moved into a beautiful townhouse, felt like another slap. But more than that, the implication that my mother's final wishes meant nothing, that her love for me could be erased and redistributed, shattered something inside me. Brandon, who had been silent until now, decided to add his perspective. Besides, what would you even do with fancy dishes? You probably eat takeout every night anyway. The assumption was so wrong, it would have been funny if it weren't so cruel. Sarah was actually a talented chef, and we spent most evenings cooking together, talking about our days, planning our future. The townhouse Patricia had dismissed was filled with warmth and laughter and real conversation, everything this house had lacked since my mother died. Frank cleared his throat clearly, eager to end the discussion. The bottom line is simple, Will. This is my house, my table, my family. If you can't respect that, maybe you should think about finding somewhere else to spend your holidays. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. This was it. This was my father telling me in front of the woman I loved that I was no longer welcome in the only home I had ever known. That the family I'd spent 20 years trying to fit into had officially voted me out. Sarah's grip on my hand was the only thing keeping me grounded as the room waited for my response. Patricia's children smirked with satisfaction. Frank's face showed no emotion at all. And I realized that no amount of trying, no amount of hoping was ever going to change this dynamic. The father I remembered from before my mother's death, the man who taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework and told me bedtime stories, was gone. He had been replaced by this stranger who valued his new wife's approval more than his own son's heart. I needed air. I needed space. I needed to understand how we had arrived at this moment. Dad, can I talk to you privately for a minute? Frank sighed dramatically as if I was asking for some enormous favor. Well, I think we've said everything that needs to be said. Please, just 5 minutes. Patricia's eyes narrowed, but Frank nodded reluctantly. Fine, kitchen. Make it quick. Sarah squeezed my hand before releasing it. I'll wait right here, she said. Her voice steady, despite the chaos she had just witnessed. Frank led me into the kitchen where my mother had spent countless hours preparing family meals. Even here, Patricia's influence was overwhelming. New appliances, new paint, new everything that erased any trace of the woman who had once made this house a home. What do you want, Will? Frank asked, leaning against the granite countertop that had replaced my mother's butcher block workspace. I want to understand what happened to you, to us. When did you decide I wasn't your son anymore? His laugh was bitter. Don't be dramatic. You're still my son. But being my son doesn't give you the right to disrupt my family's happiness. Your family's happiness. What about my happiness? What about treating me with basic human decency? Decency. Frank's voice rose. You want to talk about decency? When was the last time you called just to check on me? When was the last time you remembered my birthday without Patricia reminding you? When was the last time you showed any interest in my life, beyond showing up here expecting dinner? The accusations felt rehearsed, like he had been practicing them, and maybe he had. Maybe Patricia had been coaching him for this conversation for months. I stopped calling because every conversation turned into a lecture about how wonderful Patricia's children are. I stopped remembering your birthday because you forgot mine 3 years in a row. I stopped showing interest because every time I asked about your life, you changed the subject to talk about Marcus's job or Jessica's boyfriend or Brandon's latest achievement. Frank's jaw tightened. Those kids appreciate what they have. They don't take everything for granted like you do. Take what for granted? What exactly have you given me to take for granted? A roof over your head when you visit, food on the table, the chance to be part of a family. Part of a family. The words exploded out of me. Dad, you just told me I don't have a seat at your table because I'm not family. How is that including me? Because real family earns their place. Real family contributes. Real family doesn't just show up when it's convenient and expect everyone else to cater to them. The kitchen door swung open and Patricia entered with the confidence of someone who knew she was in charge. Is everything all right in here? We can hear you from the dining room. Everything's fine, Frank said quickly. Will and I are just working through some misunderstandings. Patricia moved to Frank's side, her hand sliding possessively around his arm. You know, Will, I think it might be helpful if you understood something. Frank has been so much happier since he stopped worrying about constantly trying to please you. He's more relaxed, more present with the rest of us. Maybe this is actually a blessing in disguise. The casual cruelty of her words took my breath away. She was telling me that my father was happier without me, that my absence was a gift to his new family. Patricia, that's enough, Frank said, but his tone held no real conviction. No, Frank, he needs to hear this. Will, your father spent years walking on eggshells around you, trying to include you in things you clearly didn't want to be part of? He worried constantly that you felt left out or neglected. But honey, you can't force someone to be part of a family if they don't want to be. I do want to be part of the family. I've always wanted that. Then why don't you act like it? Patricia's voice turned sharp. Why don't you visit unless there's a holiday involved? Why don't you show any interest in our lives unless it directly affects you? I wanted to explain that every phone call had been met with coldness, every visit had been filled with subtle digs and obvious preferences for her children, every attempt at connection had been rebuffed or redirected. But I could see from Frank's expression that he believed every word she was saying. Maybe, Patricia continued, it's time for you to find somewhere else to spend holidays, somewhere with people who actually want you there. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Frank was watching me carefully, waiting to see how I would respond to his wife's ultimatum. Is that what you want, Dad? You want me to stop coming here? Frank's hesitation told me everything I needed to know, but his words were even worse. I want you to make an effort. I want you to show me that being here matters to you. But if you can't do that, then maybe Patricia has a point. The betrayal was complete. My father was choosing his wife of 20 years over his son of 32 years. He was choosing the easy path, the path that required no conflict with the woman who shared his bed. I heard footsteps in the hallway and Marcus appeared in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but we're ready to start dinner. Are we still waiting for Will to decide whether he wants to join us? The smirk on his face made it clear this wasn't an innocent question. This was the final test, the ultimate humiliation. Either I would beg for a place at my own father's table, or I would leave and prove their point about me not really wanting to be family. Frank reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. Here, for gas money. I know you drove a long way. The $20 felt like a tip you'd give to someone who delivered your groceries. It was the final insult, the ultimate reduction of our relationship to a financial transaction. Keep it, I said, pushing the money away. I think I finally understand where I stand. I turned to leave the kitchen, but Patricia's voice stopped me. Oh, and Will, next time you decide to visit, maybe call first. We'd hate for there to be any more misunderstandings about whether you're expected. The message was clear, there would be no next time. This was goodbye disguised as advice. I walked back into the dining room where Sarah was sitting uncomfortably on the couch surrounded by Patricia's children who were making no effort to include her in their conversation. She looked up at me with relief and concern. Ready to go? I asked. She nodded immediately, gathering her purse and coat. As we headed toward the door, I could hear Marcus raising his wine glass in the dining room. To real family bonds, he announced loudly, and the people who actually show up when it matters. The laughter that followed us out of the house was the sound of a door closing forever. But as I helped Sarah into the car and started the engine, I realized I had heard something else in that kitchen conversation. Something that didn't add up. Patricia had known too much about my relationship with Frank. She had spoken with too much authority about his feelings and motivations. And Frank had seemed almost relieved to have her speak for him, as if he was tired of thinking for himself. As we drove away from the house where I'd spent my childhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than simple family preference. Patricia's confidence seemed born of something deeper than just marital influence. It felt like the confidence of someone who had been planning this moment for a very long time. Sarah and I drove in silence for the first 10 minutes, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. Finally, she reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "Pull over when you're ready to talk," she said gently. I found a rest area off Highway 95 and parked under a bare oak tree. The December afternoon was gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. Sarah turned in her seat to face me, her eyes full of concern and barely contained anger. Well, what just happened in there was not normal. That was not family dysfunction. That was abuse. Her words hit me like a physical blow because I knew she was right. I had spent so many years making excuses for Frank's behavior, attributing his coldness to grief or adjustment to his new marriage. But what I had witnessed today went beyond neglect or favoritism. It was calculated cruelty designed to humiliate me in front of the woman I loved. I keep thinking about my mother's dishes. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She picked them out for her hope chest when she was 18. She told me stories about saving up to buy each piece while she was working at the diner downtown. She made me promise to take care of them when she died. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. And your father just gave them away like they meant nothing. That's what I don't understand. Frank isn't naturally cruel. He's weak, he's easily influenced, but he's not vindictive. This felt like Patricia's plan executed through him. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at the screen expecting to see Frank's name with some half-hearted apology. Instead, it was my cousin Danny. "Hey man, heard you were supposed to be at Uncle Frank's today. How did it go? Call me when you get a chance." Danny was Frank's nephew, the son of Frank's older brother, who had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Danny and I had grown up together more like brothers than cousins, but we had drifted apart after I started college and he joined the military. Still, we maintained sporadic contact, usually around holidays or family events. I showed Sarah the text. "That's weird. How would Danny know I was supposed to be there today?" "He hasn't been invited to Christmas dinner since Patricia took over hosting." "Call him," Sarah suggested. "Maybe he knows something we don't." I dialed Danny's number and he answered on the first ring. "Will Jesus, I was hoping you'd call. Where are you right now?" "Sitting in a parking lot trying to figure out what the hell just happened at my father's house." "Danny, how did you know I was supposed to be there?" because I was supposed to be there too until Patricia called yesterday and uninvited me. She said they were keeping it small this year, immediate family only. But then she made a weird comment about how it would be better if I wasn't there to see Uncle Frank finally set some boundaries with you. Sarah and I exchanged glances. This was not a spontaneous decision to exclude me. This had been planned in advance. Danny, can you meet us somewhere? I think we need to talk. Absolutely. There's a diner on Route 1 in Norwalk called Mickey's. I'm 20 minutes away. We'll see you there. Mickey's Diner was the kind of place that specialized in comfort food and unlimited coffee refills. Danny was already waiting in a corner booth when we arrived, his military posture unmistakable even in civilian clothes. He had filled out since I last saw him, his brown hair shorter and his face more angular, but his smile was exactly the same. He stood to hug me, then shook Sarah's hand warmly when I introduced them. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, he said, but I'm glad Will has someone like you looking out for him. Danny, tell me exactly what Patricia said when she called you. Danny pulled out his phone and scrolled through his call log. She called at 11:30 yesterday morning, said they were keeping Christmas dinner intimate this year, just Frank and her kids. Then she said, and I quote, "It's probably better if you're not there anyway. Frank is finally going to set some boundaries with Will, and it might get uncomfortable." She knew, Sarah said immediately. She knew they were going to humiliate you, and she didn't want any witnesses who might take your side. There's more, Danny continued. After she hung up, I called my mom to ask if she knew anything about family drama I was missing. Mom said Patricia had called her last week, asking detailed questions about your job, your living situation, your relationship with Sarah. She was fishing for information. This was getting worse by the minute. Patricia hadn't just decided to exclude me on a whim. She had been researching my life, gathering ammunition for today's attack. Danny, you know my father better than almost anyone. Have you noticed any changes in him lately? Danny's expression darkened. Well, I've been worried about Uncle Frank for months. The last few times I've seen him, he seemed stressed, distracted. He kept talking about financial pressures and making comments about needing to prioritize what really matters. I thought he was just dealing with normal middle-age stuff, but now I'm wondering if there was more to it. What kind of financial pressures? He mentioned something about the house needing major repairs, unexpected medical bills for Patricia's mother, college loans for her kids. But here's the thing. I drove past their house last week, and they had professional landscapers installing a new garden design. That's not the kind of expense you take on if you're struggling financially. Sarah leaned forward. Unless the money is coming from somewhere else? Danny nodded grimly. There's something else. Last month at a family barbecue, Uncle Frank was talking to my dad's old friend Pete about gambling. Pete owns a small casino up in Connecticut, and Frank was asking all kinds of questions about poker games and betting limits. Pete mentioned it to me later because he thought it was odd. Uncle Frank never showed any interest in gambling before. My stomach dropped. Gambling addiction would explain a lot of Frank's recent behavior. The stress, the financial pressures, the sudden willingness to cut me out of his life rather than risk losing Patricia's support. Do you think he's in trouble? I think he's in over his head with something, and Patricia's using it to her advantage. Think about it, Will. If Frank owes money or has gotten himself into some kind of financial hole, Patricia has leverage over him. She can threaten to leave and take her support with her unless he does what she wants. And what she wants is me out of the picture. Exactly. You're the only person left who remembers what Frank was like before he married her. You're the only one who questions her authority in that house. You're a threat to her control. Sarah had been listening intently, and now she spoke up. There's something else we need to consider. Will you mention that your mother left you money and property in her will? What happened to that inheritance? I felt the blood drain from my face. Frank was supposed to hold it in trust until I turned 25. He said he was investing it for me, growing it for my future. When I turned 25, he said the investments needed more time to mature. When I turned 30, he said the market was down and it wasn't a good time to withdraw. I trusted him. I never pressed for details. Danny's eyes widened. Will, that inheritance was substantial? Your mom had life insurance savings, the value from selling her parents' farm. We're talking about serious money. How much money? I don't know exactly, but enough to pay off a house, enough to send kids to college, enough to cover massive gambling debts. The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. My father hadn't just excluded me from Christmas dinner. He had potentially stolen my inheritance and was using Patricia's children as a justification for cutting me out of his life permanently. If I disappeared from the family, there would be no one left to ask uncomfortable questions about where my mother's money had gone. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand. Well, we need to find out what's really going on. This isn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This could be fraud. Danny nodded in agreement. And if Uncle Frank is in as much trouble as I think he is, he needs help whether he realizes it or not. Patricia is using him, and when she's done, she's going to leave him with nothing. I thought about the man I had left at that dining room table a few hours ago. Smug, confident, surrounded by people who praised him and agreed with his every word. He had no idea that his wife had been systematically isolating him from anyone who might warn him about the trap he was walking into. What do you think we should do? Danny's expression was grim but determined. We need to find out exactly how deep this goes. And then we need to decide whether to save Frank from himself or let him face the consequences of choosing Patricia over his own son. As we sat in that diner booth planning our next move, I realized that Christmas Day wasn't ending with my exclusion from the family. It was beginning with the discovery that my family had been under attack for years, and I had been too hurt and too trusting to recognize the signs. But now I knew. And now I was going to find out exactly what Patricia had done to my father and what she had taken from me in the process. The question was, would Frank thank me for exposing the truth? Or would he hate me for destroying the illusion of happiness Patricia had created for him? Either way, I was done being the victim in this story. It was time to fight back. Sarah and I spent the rest of Christmas evening at Danny's apartment, using his computer and our combined knowledge of my family's history to piece together a timeline of Patricia's manipulation. What we discovered was far worse than any of us had imagined. We need to start with the financial records, Danny said, pulling up a credit monitoring website. If Uncle Frank has been using your identity or your inheritance improperly, there should be traces. I entered my social security number and personal information requesting a comprehensive credit report. What appeared on the screen made my blood run cold. There were 3 credit cards I had never opened, 2 personal loans I had never taken, and a mortgage application I had never signed. This is impossible, I said, staring at the numbers. I've never applied for any of these accounts. Sarah leaned over my shoulder, reading the details. The mortgage application was submitted 4 months ago for $150,000. That's not for repairs or medical bills. That's serious money. Danny pulled out his phone. I'm calling my friend Helen. She's your mom's old neighbor who helped settle the estate when your mother died. If anyone would have copies of the original will and trust documents, it would be her. Helen Kowalski lived in the same house she had owned for 40 years right next door to where I had grown up. She had been my mother's closest friend and had served as an unofficial witness to many of the family's important decisions after my mother's cancer diagnosis. Helen, it's Danny Morrison. I'm here with Will and we need your help. 30 minutes later, we were sitting in Helen's living room, surrounded by manila folders and photocopied documents. Helen, now in her 70s but sharp as ever, had maintained meticulous records of everything related to my mother's estate. I saved all of this because I was worried something like this might happen, she said, handing me a folder marked Will Morrison, Trust Documents. Your father started asking strange questions about the estate about 2 years ago. He wanted to know about liquidation procedures and whether beneficiaries had to be notified of changes. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside was the original trust document clearly stating that my mother's entire estate, valued at $230,000, was to be held in trust for me until age 25, at which point I would gain full control of the funds. According to this, Sarah said, reading over my shoulder, you should have received full access to this money 7 years ago. Helen nodded grimly. And that's not all. Your mother specifically included language about the china set, her jewelry, and several pieces of furniture. Everything was supposed to go to you, not be integrated into Frank's household. She handed me another document that made my hands shake. It was a letter my mother had written to me to be delivered when I received my inheritance. My dearest Will. The letter began, if you're reading this, then you've reached your 25th birthday and are beginning your adult life in earnest. This money represents not just my love for you, but my confidence in the man you've become. Use it to build something beautiful, a home, a family, a life that honors the values we shared. Remember that real wealth comes not from what you accumulate, but from the love you give and receive. I am so proud of the person you are becoming. Tears blurred my vision as I read my mother's words. She had meant for this inheritance to be the foundation of my future, not the fuel for my father's financial irresponsibility. Helen, do you know what Frank did with the money? Her expression was pained. I'm afraid I do. About 3 years ago, Patricia came to see me. She said Frank was having some difficulties with the trust investments and asked if I knew anything about the original terms. When I showed her the documents, she became very interested in the liquidation clauses. What kind of difficulties? Patricia claimed the trust account had lost money in the stock market and that Frank was considering cashing out to prevent further losses. She wanted to know if there were any legal requirements for him to notify you before making changes. Danny and I exchanged glances. And what did you tell her? I told her the truth, that as trustee, Frank had a fiduciary duty to protect your interests and that any major changes should be discussed with you directly. But then she said something that bothered me. Helen paused, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. She said, well, Will is so busy with his own life now. Sometimes it's better to make decisions for adult children when they're not mature enough to understand the complexities involved. It sounded rehearsed, like she was practicing an argument. Sarah leaned forward. Did she say anything else? She asked very specific questions about whether you had ever formally requested information about the trust. When I said no, she seemed relieved. Then she asked whether there was any requirement for Frank to provide annual statements or updates. This was worse than identity theft. This was a systematic plan to steal my inheritance while making sure I remained ignorant of the theft. There's more, Helen continued. Last year, Patricia's oldest son, Marcus, came to see me. He said he was doing research for a family history project and wanted to know about your mother's background, her family's property holdings, things like that. Why would Marcus care about my mother's family history? That's what I wondered. But then he started asking about your mother's jewelry collection and whether I knew if any of the pieces were particularly valuable. When I mentioned that your mother had inherited several antique pieces from her grandmother, he became very interested in getting details. Helen disappeared into her bedroom and returned with a small jewelry box. Your mother gave me this before she died. She said if anything ever happened to Frank or if he remarried and you felt uncomfortable asking for your inheritance, I should make sure you got these. Inside the box were my mother's engagement ring, a pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, and several other pieces I remembered her wearing on special occasions. They weren't just valuable, they were irreplaceable family heirlooms. Patricia told Frank that you weren't interested in keeping your mother's jewelry, Helen said softly. She convinced him to let her daughters wear the pieces to formal events. When I objected, Frank said you had already told him to dispose of the jewelry however he saw fit. I never said that. I never even knew the jewelry was available. I know, dear, that's why I kept these pieces safe. I had a feeling Patricia was lying. The picture was becoming crystal clear. Patricia had been systematically looting my inheritance while poisoning Frank against me to prevent him from feeling guilty about the theft. She had used her children as accomplices, gathering information and justifying the redistribution of my mother's possessions. Danny pulled out his laptop and began searching for public records. If Frank took out a mortgage against the house, it should be recorded with the county clerk's office. Within minutes, he found what we were looking for. Here it is. Frank refinanced the house 6 months ago, taking out a $200,000 mortgage on a property that was previously paid off. That's almost exactly the amount of my inheritance. I said, the pieces falling into place. And look at this, Sarah added, pointing to another document on the screen. The mortgage application lists Patricia's children as co-borrowers. They're all legally responsible for this debt. Helen shook her head sadly. Frank has no idea what he's gotten himself into, does he? Patricia has made sure that her children benefit from your mother's money, while Frank takes all the legal and financial responsibility. I thought about the man I had left at the dinner table earlier today. Arrogant, dismissive, convinced of his righteousness. He had no idea that he was being used by the woman he trusted most in the world. There's something else? Helen said quietly. Last month I saw Patricia having lunch with a man I didn't recognize. They were sitting in the back corner of Romano's restaurant looking very intense. When I walked by their table, I heard her say something about finalizing the timeline and making sure Frank doesn't change his mind. Did you get a good look at the man? Middle-aged, expensive suit, very professional looking. He had a briefcase with him and they were going over papers. It looked like a business meeting, but Patricia seemed nervous. Danny was already typing on his laptop. I'm going to run a property search to see if Frank has been meeting with real estate agents or financial advisors. If Patricia is planning to leave him, she might be positioning herself to take as much as possible when she goes. What he found was devastating. Frank had been meeting with a bankruptcy attorney. The consultation notes, which were part of the public record, indicated that Frank was considering filing for Chapter 13 bankruptcy protection due to gambling debts and overextended credit. He owes money to bookmakers, Danny said, reading the legal documents. Over $60,000 to various gambling establishments and private lenders. The attorney's notes indicate that Frank's wife was unaware of the extent of the financial difficulties and that Frank was concerned about the impact on his family. But Patricia isn't unaware, Sarah said immediately. She's been orchestrating this whole thing. She encouraged the gambling, helped him access my inheritance money, and now she's positioning herself to leave him holding all the debt while she and her children walk away with everything they can carry. Helen handed me one more document. This is a copy of a conversation I recorded last month. I was worried about Frank, so when he came over drunk and started talking about his problems, I used my phone to record what he said. She played the audio file, and my father's voice filled the room, slurred with alcohol and heavy with regret. Helen, I screwed up so bad. Will was right to stay away from us. Patricia's been pushing me to choose between him and her kids, and I chose wrong. But now I'm in so deep I can't get out. The gambling, the loans, the lies I've told. Will's inheritance is gone. I used it to pay off debts, and now I owe even more. Patricia says her kids will take care of me when I'm old, but I know she's lying. She's already talked to a divorce lawyer. I heard her on the phone. The recording continued with Frank's drunken confession about how much he missed me, how he regretted letting Patricia isolate him from his son, and how scared he was of facing the consequences of his decisions alone. He knows, I said quietly. He knows Patricia is using him, and he knows he's destroyed our relationship for nothing. The question is, Danny said, what are we going to do about it? I looked around the room at the evidence of my father's deception and my stepmother's calculated cruelty. I had a choice to make. I could walk away and let Frank face the consequences of his choices, or I could try to save a man who had publicly humiliated me just hours earlier. But as I sat there listening to my father's broken voice on Helen's recording, I realized that revenge wasn't what I wanted. Justice was what I wanted, and justice meant exposing Patricia's manipulation while giving Frank a chance to redeem himself. The question was whether he would take that chance or whether he was too far gone to save. Monday morning found Sarah and me sitting in the law office of Margaret Chen, a family lawyer Danny had recommended who specialized in financial fraud and estate disputes. The evidence we had gathered over the weekend was spread across her conference table like pieces of a complex puzzle. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said, after reviewing the documents, "what your father has done constitutes several serious crimes. Identity theft, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially elder abuse if your stepmother has been manipulating him financially. What are our options? You could file criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would likely result in your father's imprisonment and financial ruin. Or you could use this evidence as leverage to force a resolution that protects your interests while giving your father a chance to make things right." Sarah leaned forward. "What would that look like?" "We would approach your father with the evidence and demand immediate restoration of your inheritance plus damages for the fraudulent use of your credit. We would also require him to provide a full accounting of all transactions related to your mother's estate and to remove your stepmother from any financial decision-making authority. And if he refuses," Margaret's expression was grim, "then we file everything with the district attorney's office and let the criminal justice system handle it. But Mr. Morrison, you should understand that Patricia appears to be the mastermind here. Your father may be more victim than perpetrator. That afternoon, I called my father's office. Frank worked as a regional manager for an insurance company, a job he had held for over 15 years. His secretary put me through immediately. 'Will, is everything all right?' 'You don't usually call during business hours.' His voice sounded strained, tired. Nothing like the confident patriarch from Christmas Day. 'Dad, we need to talk, tonight, just the two of us.' 'I don't think that's a good idea.' Patricia was pretty upset after yesterday. She thinks you're trying to cause problems in our marriage. 'Dad, I have information about your financial situation that you need to hear. This isn't about family drama anymore. This is about protecting you from making a mistake that could destroy your life.' There was a long pause. 'What kind of information?' 'The kind that should be discussed face to face. Meet me at Danny's apartment at 7 o'clock. Come alone.' 'Well, I can't just—' 'Dad, you're in serious trouble. The kind of trouble that could result in criminal charges and bankruptcy. I'm trying to help you, but I need you to trust me enough to have one conversation.' Another pause, longer this time. 'All right, 7 o'clock. Danny's apartment felt like a war room by the time Frank arrived. We had organized the evidence into clear categories: the identity theft documents, the estate fraud paperwork, the mortgage records, and Helen's recorded conversation. Sarah had prepared a timeline showing how Patricia's manipulations had escalated over the past 3 years. Frank looked terrible. His clothes were wrinkled, his face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he sat down across from us. This was not the confident man who had dismissed me from his dinner table 36 hours earlier. "Before you say anything," he began, "I want you to know that what happened yesterday was wrong. I've been thinking about it all day, and I realize I let my emotions get the better of me. Dad, this isn't about hurt feelings. This is about fraud and identity theft, and the systematic theft of my inheritance." I handed him the credit report showing the accounts opened in my name. Frank's face went white as he read the details. "I don't understand. How did you get this?" "It's my credit report, Dad. My name, my social security number, my signature on applications I never submitted." "Did you think I would never find out?" Frank's hands were shaking harder now. "Well, I can explain. I was in trouble and I needed money quickly. I was going to pay it all back before you ever found out. Pay it back with what you've already spent my entire inheritance and taken out a mortgage against the house. You owe gambling debts to people who don't accept payment plans." The mention of gambling debts made Frank's eyes go wide. "How do you know about that?" Danny handed him the bankruptcy consultation documents. "Because you left a paper trail, Uncle Frank, and because Patricia has been meeting with lawyers and real estate agents behind your back." "That's impossible. Patricia doesn't know about the gambling." Sarah laughed bitterly. "Frank, Patricia orchestrated this entire situation. She encouraged your gambling, helped you access Will's money, and positioned herself to walk away clean when everything collapses. I played Helen's recording of Frank's drunken confession. As his own voice filled the room describing his regrets and fears, Frank buried his face in his hands. "She said she loved me," he whispered. "She said her kids would take care of me. She said choosing them over you was the right thing to do. And you believed her because it was easier than facing the truth about what you had done to your own son." Frank looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Well, I know I can't undo what I've done. But Patricia isn't the mastermind you think she is. She's just protecting her children the same way any mother would." Danny pulled out his laptop and showed Frank the real estate listings Patricia had been researching. "Uncle Frank, she's been looking at condos in Florida, single occupancy units in retirement communities, properties that would accommodate one person, not a blended family. She's leaving you, Dad. She's been planning to leave you from the moment she figured out how much money she could extract from the situation." Frank stared at the real estate listings in stunned silence. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want me to do?" I handed him the legal documents Margaret had prepared. "I want you to sign an agreement returning my inheritance with interest and damages. I want you to remove Patricia from all financial accounts and decision-making authority, and I want you to get help for your gambling addiction. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning these documents go to the district attorney's office and you'll be facing criminal charges for identity theft and fraud. Patricia will testify against you to protect herself and her children, and you'll lose everything anyway." Frank read through the agreement slowly, his face growing paler with each page. "Well, even if I wanted to sign this, I don't have the money to pay you back. It's all gone." "Actually, you do have the money. Patricia has been hiding assets in her children's names. The mortgage money, the profits from selling your mother's jewelry, the proceeds from the insurance settlement Patricia claimed was for her mother's medical bills. It's all there, but it's been moved around to make it harder to trace." Sarah handed him a financial analysis she had prepared. "We've tracked most of it. Patricia's daughter Jessica bought a house last year with money she couldn't possibly have earned at her job as a receptionist. Marcus made several large investments that don't match his income level. Brandon bought a new car with cash. They've been laundering your stolen money through Patricia's children," Danny explained. "But the good news is that it's recoverable if you act quickly." Frank was crying now, the full weight of his situation finally hitting him. "She played me. Patricia played me completely, and I let her turn me against my own son. The question is what you're going to do about it now." Frank wiped his eyes and looked directly at me. "If I sign this agreement, if I try to make things right, will you give me a chance to earn your forgiveness?" "Dad, I'm here offering you a way out of this mess when I could just as easily let you face the consequences alone. What does that tell you about forgiveness?" He nodded slowly and reached for a pen. "What do I need to do first?" "First, you're going to sign this agreement. Then you're going to go home and confront Patricia with what you've learned. You're going to demand that she return the money her children received, or you're going to file charges against all of them. And if she refuses, then you're going to find out who Patricia really is when the money runs out and the criminal charges start flying." Frank signed the document with a shaking hand. As he did, I realized that this was either the beginning of my father's redemption, or the moment he finally faced the consequences of 20 years of poor decisions. Either way, Patricia's control over our family was about to end. "Dad, there's one more thing. Patricia is going to know something is wrong the moment you start asking questions about the money. She's going to try to manipulate you into backing down. Are you strong enough to follow through with this?" Frank looked up at me with something I hadn't seen in his eyes for years: determination. "Well, I've lost 20 years with my son because I was too weak to stand up to her manipulation. I'm not losing whatever time I have left." As Frank left Danny's apartment that night, I realized that the real test wasn't whether he would sign a legal document. The real test was whether he had the courage to face the woman who had been controlling his life and demand that she return what she had stolen. Tomorrow would tell us who Frank Morrison really was, Patricia's puppet or my father. Frank called me at 6:30 the next morning, his voice tight with stress but determined. "Well, I need you and Danny to come to the house at 2 o'clock this afternoon." Patricia will be there with her kids for their weekly family meeting. I want to confront them with everything while they're all together. Dad, are you sure you're ready for this? Once you start this conversation, there's no going back. I'm ready. I spent all night thinking about what you showed me, and I realized something. Patricia has been treating me like a mark from the beginning. Every decision she's convinced me to make has benefited her children at my expense. It's time she faced the consequences. Sarah and I arrived at the house with Danny at exactly 2 o'clock. Frank answered the door himself, looking more focused than I had seen him in years. The weakness and confusion from the night before had been replaced by cold resolve. "They're in the living room," he said quietly. "I haven't told them why you're here yet. I wanted you to see their reactions when I start asking questions." We followed Frank into the living room where Patricia and her 3 children were seated on the sectional sofa, looking comfortable and confident. Patricia's expression darkened when she saw me, but she maintained her composure. "Frank, what is this about?" "I thought we agreed that Will needed some space from the family right now. We need to talk about money, Patricia. Specifically, we need to talk about where certain money has gone and how it got there." Marcus rolled his eyes. "Dad, if this is about Christmas dinner, we've already explained that we were just trying to protect the family dynamic." Will was being dramatic as usual. Frank pulled out a folder and set it on the coffee table. "Marcus, this has nothing to do with Christmas dinner. This is about the $200,000 I borrowed against this house and where that money went." The room went completely silent. Patricia's confident expression flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "Frank, what are you talking about?" "That money went to pay off debts and handle family emergencies. We discussed all of this." "Which debts, Patricia? Which emergencies? Because I have a detailed accounting here and the numbers don't add up." Frank opened the folder and pulled out bank statements, loan documents, and transfer records. "Jessica, you bought a house last year for $140,000. You put down 20% in cash. That's $28,000. Your job as a receptionist pays $32,000 a year before taxes. Where did the down payment money come from?" Jessica's face went pale. I saved up, and I had some family help. Family help from whom your biological father hasn't spoken to your mother in 5 years. Your grandparents are living on Social Security. So where did $28,000 in cash come from? Patricia stood up abruptly. "Frank, I don't like your tone. Jessica worked very hard to save for that house." "Sit down, Patricia. We're just getting started." Frank's voice carried an authority I hadn't heard from him in decades. "Marcus, you made several large stock purchases last year, totaling $45,000. Brandon, you bought a new truck with $15,000 cash. Patricia, you've been wearing jewelry that belonged to Will's mother, jewelry that was specifically left to him in his mother's will." The siblings were exchanging panicked glances, now their earlier confidence evaporating. "I don't know what Will has told you," Patricia said, her voice rising, "but he's obviously trying to cause trouble in our family. This is exactly the kind of manipulation I warned you about." Frank smiled coldly. "Actually, Will didn't tell me anything I hadn't already figured out. He just helped me organize the evidence." He pulled out the credit reports showing the fraudulent accounts opened in my name. "Did you know that Will's credit has been compromised? Someone has been opening accounts in his name and using his identity to secure loans." "That's terrible," Patricia said quickly. "Identity theft is such a problem these days. Will should report that to the authorities." "Oh, he is going to report it. But first we're going to talk about how someone got access to Will's personal information. Someone who lived in this house and had access to his Social Security number and personal documents." Marcus stood up angrily. "Are you accusing us of identity theft? That's insane." Frank handed him one of the loan applications. "Marcus, this is your signature as a co-signer on one of these fraudulent loans. The loan officer noted that you provided Will's Social Security number and claimed to be acting on his behalf as a family member." The room erupted. Jessica started crying. Brandon began shouting about being framed, and Marcus demanded to see a lawyer. But Patricia's reaction was the most telling. She went completely calm, her mask of concerned wife and mother dropping completely. Frank, you're making a very serious mistake. If you pursue this ridiculous accusation, you're going to destroy this family and any chance you have of a comfortable future. Are you threatening me, Patricia? I'm reminding you of reality. You're a 60-year-old man with gambling debts and no savings. Where exactly do you think you're going to be if you drive away the only people who care about you? Danny stepped forward. Actually, Patricia, let's talk about reality. We know about the real estate listings you've been researching in Florida, single occupancy retirement condos. We know about your meetings with divorce attorneys. We know about your boyfriend. Patricia's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Patricia a photograph. This is you having lunch with James Patterson last week at Romano's restaurant. James Patterson, who happens to be a real estate agent specializing in Florida retirement properties. The same James Patterson who filed a business registration last month for a property management company listing you as a partner. The silence in the room was deafening. Frank was staring at his wife with an expression of complete betrayal, while her children were beginning to realize that their mother had been lying to everyone, including them. "Mom," Jessica whispered, "is this true? Are you leaving Frank?" Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this family. I married a man who was still in love with his dead wife. I raised a son who resented me from day one. I tried to build a life here, but none of you ever appreciated what I brought to this situation. What you brought was manipulation and theft," Frank said quietly. "You convinced me to choose your children over my son. You encouraged my gambling addiction because it gave you access to money. You systematically looted Will's inheritance while making me believe it was for family emergencies. I gave you a family, Frank, a real family that actually cared about you. You gave me a fantasy while you robbed me blind." Marcus was staring at his mother in shock. "Mom, did you really steal from Will? Did you really use us to launder money?" "I protected you," Patricia snapped. "All of you. I made sure you had opportunities and security that you never would have had otherwise. And this is how you repay me, by siding with Frank against your own mother." Brandon shook his head slowly. "Mom, you told us that Frank wanted to help us. You said he offered to pay for our houses and cars because he loved us like his own children. He did love you. That's why he was willing to make sacrifices. Sacrifices of money that wasn't his to give," I said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. "Money that belonged to me and was stolen through fraud and identity theft." Patricia turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes. "You self-righteous little boy. You have no idea what real family sacrifice looks like. You waltzed in here expecting everyone to cater to your feelings while the rest of us did the actual work of building a life together. The actual work of stealing my inheritance and destroying my relationship with my father. Your father destroyed that relationship himself by choosing people who actually contributed to his happiness over a son who brought nothing but judgment and resentment." Frank stood up slowly, his face grave with finality. "Patricia, I want you and your children out of my house by this weekend. I want every piece of stolen property returned, every fraudulent account closed, and every dollar of Will's money back in his possession within 30 days. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning the police will be here with warrants for your arrest and the arrest of your children as co-conspirators in identity theft and fraud." Patricia looked around the room, realizing that her years of manipulation and control were over. Her children were staring at her with shock and disappointment. Her husband was finally seeing through her lies. And her escape plan with James Patterson was exposed before it could be executed. "Fine," she said coldly. "But don't expect me to make this easy. If I'm going down, I'm taking all of you with me." She walked out of the living room with her head held high, but I could see the fear in her eyes. For the first time in 20 years, Patricia was facing consequences for her actions, and there was no one left to manipulate into protecting her. Frank collapsed into his chair, emotionally drained but finally free. Well, I know this doesn't fix everything between us, but it's a start. I looked at my father, really looked at him, for the first time in years. He was older, grayer, marked by the stress of Patricia's manipulation. But underneath the damage, I could see traces of the man who had raised me before grief and loneliness made him vulnerable to a predator like Patricia. It's a start, I agreed. The war was over, but the real work of rebuilding our family was just beginning. 6 months later, I sat in the same dining room where Patricia had humiliated me on Christmas Day, but everything was different. The table was set for 4, Frank, Sarah, Danny, and me. The china was my mother's blue and white set, carefully retrieved from storage where Frank had hidden it to protect it from Patricia's interference. The house felt lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. Patricia had indeed tried to take everyone down with her when she left. She hired an aggressive attorney and attempted to claim spousal rights to half of everything Frank owned, including the house that had been in my family for 3 generations. She accused Frank of financial abuse and claimed that she had been manipulated into helping with the identity theft. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The pattern of manipulation, the systematic theft, the deliberate isolation of Frank from his family, the recorded conversations and financial documents all painted a clear picture of a woman who had methodically destroyed my father's judgment while enriching herself and her children. Marcus, Jessica, and Brandon had initially stood by their mother, but as more evidence emerged, they began to realize how completely she had used them. Jessica's marriage had suffered when her husband learned that their house had been purchased with stolen money. Marcus faced professional consequences when his employer discovered his involvement in identity theft. Brandon had been forced to return the truck and take on debt to repay what he had unwittingly received. One by one, Patricia's children had begun to see their mother clearly. They provided testimony about her manipulative tactics, her lies about Frank's motivations, and her plans to abandon Frank once she had extracted maximum benefit from the relationship. The legal resolution had been swift once Patricia's lies unraveled. She pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud and identity theft in exchange for a reduced sentence of 3 years in prison and full restitution of my inheritance. Her boyfriend, James Patterson, was also charged as an accomplice in the financial scheme. Frank had suffered consequences too, but he faced them with dignity and determination. He entered Gamblers Anonymous and began working with a therapist to understand how his grief and loneliness had made him vulnerable to Patricia's manipulation. He sold some possessions to help cover the restitution payments and took on additional work to rebuild his finances. Most importantly, he had spent the past 6 months proving that his commitment to rebuilding our relationship was genuine. He called every week not to ask for anything, but simply to check on my life and share what was happening in his. He attended counseling sessions with me to work through the damage that had been done to our trust. He made no excuses for his choices, but took full responsibility for the pain he had caused. "Will," Frank said, as we finished dinner on this warm June evening, "I want you to know that having you back in my life is the best thing that's happened to me in 20 years. Sarah smiled and squeezed my hand under the table. She had been instrumental in my decision to rebuild the relationship with Frank, pointing out that holding on to anger would only continue Patricia's work of destroying our family. "I want to show you something," Frank said, disappearing into his study and returning with a small wooden box. "I've been working on this for the past few months." Inside the box was a photo album documenting my entire childhood, carefully preserved pictures that Patricia had banished from the house, but that Frank had secretly kept in storage. There were photos of my mother and me, pictures of Frank teaching me to ride a bike, images of family vacations and birthday parties, and ordinary moments that Patricia had tried to erase from our family history. "I should have never let her make me forget who we were," Frank said quietly. Your mother would have been ashamed of the man I became after she died. I flipped through the pages, remembering the father I had lost, and recognizing him in the man sitting beside me now. Mom would have been proud of you for finding your way back. Danny raised his glass of iced tea and a toast. To second chances and the courage to take them. As we sat on Frank's back porch, watching the sunset, I reflected on everything that had happened since that horrible Christmas day. Patricia's plan to drive me away from my father had ultimately backfired. Instead of destroying our relationship permanently, her cruelty had forced us to confront the truth about what had really been happening to our family. The financial recovery had been important, my inheritance was restored with interest, and I was finally able to use my mother's money the way she had intended as the foundation for building a life with Sarah. But the emotional recovery had been even more valuable. I had my father back, not the weak and manipulated man Patricia had created, but the strong and loving person he had always been underneath the damage. Frank had also reconnected with extended family members that Patricia had systematically driven away. Danny was a regular visitor now, and other relatives who had been excluded during Patricia's reign were slowly rebuilding relationships with Frank. The house was filled with laughter and conversation again the way it had been when my mother was alive. Sarah and I had decided to hold our wedding reception in Frank's backyard the following spring, a decision that would have been impossible a year ago, but now felt like the perfect way to celebrate not just our love, but the restoration of our family. You know what I've learned from all this, Frank said as we prepared to leave that evening. Real family isn't about who shows up for dinner. It's about who stands by you when everything falls apart. It's about who fights for the relationship even when it seems hopeless. I hugged my father goodbye, feeling grateful for the hard lessons that had brought us back together. Patricia's manipulation had nearly succeeded in destroying everything my mother had built for our family. But in the end, love had proved stronger than deception, and truth had proved more powerful than manipulation. The story could have ended with bitterness and permanent estrangement. Instead, it ended with redemption and the recognition that some relationships are worth fighting for no matter how much damage has been done. As Sarah and I drove home that night, she asked the question I had been thinking about for months. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Patricia completely? I considered the question carefully. I don't think forgiveness means pretending that what she did was okay. But I think it means choosing not to let her actions define the rest of my life. She took 20 years from my father and me. I'm not going to let her take any more. The real victory wasn't just getting my inheritance back or seeing Patricia face consequences for her crimes. The real victory was proving that family bonds, even when severely damaged, could be repaired with honesty, commitment, and the willingness to choose love over pride. Frank and I still had work to do to fully heal our relationship. There were conversations we needed to have, trust that needed to be rebuilt, and new traditions that needed to be established. But for the first time in 20 years, we were moving forward together instead of being pulled apart by someone else's agenda. The house where I had grown up felt like home again. The father I had lost was finding his way back to the man he used to be. And the family that Patricia had tried so hard to destroy was stronger than it had ever been before. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is showing you who they really are. Patricia had intended to hurt me, but instead she had forced me to fight for what mattered most. In the end, her cruelty had become the catalyst for our healing, and her manipulation had taught us the true value of authentic love. As we pulled into our driveway that night, I realized that the Christmas dinner humiliation that had started this entire journey was no longer a source of pain. It had become the beginning of the story of how our family found its way back to each other, proving that even the deepest wounds can heal when people are willing to choose courage over comfort and truth over convenience. The best revenge against someone who tries to destroy your family is building an even stronger family than the one they tried to tear apart. And that's exactly what we had done. Have you ever had to fight to rebuild a relationship that someone else tried to destroy? What would you do if you discovered a family member was systematically stealing from you while manipulating your other relatives against you? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about family betrayal and redemption. Share this story with someone who might need to hear that it's never too late to fight for the relationships that truly matter. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember, real family is built on truth, not convenience. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the most about what really matters in life. Stay strong, stay true to yourself, and never stop believing in the power of authentic love to overcome even the deepest betrayal.